People are working, birds are singing, and you watch this video, but in the blink of an eye, everything changes. And the world we knew comes to an end. In the White House, the American president receives the news that a large number of warheads are approaching to strike American territory. Could this be a false alarm from the American defense? Is there even a slight chance that this could be a real threat? However, the president decides not to hesitate, and America chooses to use its nuclear weapons. The MAD doctrine, America's plan for a nuclear conflict, is put into action, initially focusing on military installations where bombs are stored to prevent retaliation, but soon the strategy is abandoned in favor of bombing major cities. Revisiting the grand plans from Cold War, we see that few places in Russia and China would be spared. On the Russian side, there were also plans for which locations in the United States and Europe would be targeted, including industrial plants, NATO installations, and of course, major population centers. Soon, the first bombs detonate in strategic locations in America and Russia, such as bases and American reserve sites. However, the biggest threat lies not on land but in the ocean. Even if one side manages to destroy the land installations, nuclear submarines can strike their adversaries from afar. From this point on, the conflict begins to escalate, with major commercial centers engulfed in flames from the mushroom clouds and the effects of the explosions. People stunned don't know where to run or where to go. Allied countries are next, and everyone becomes a potential target. Mutual destruction is put into practice. In a scenario of mutual destruction, Paris, London, Berlin, New York, Moscow, and Beijing would be the first targets. The material and human loss would be tenfold greater than anything recorded in history. Within the first hours, we would see the casualty numbers that surpass both world wars combined. This would be the shortest and most brutal conflict in history. What would follow would be devastating. In non-nuclear countries, people would react with absolute fear. Fear that they might be targeted next and uncertainty about what would happen to the world going forward. The leaders of those countries would make various declarations in the media, insisting that all was not lost and that help would come for the survivors. Little did they know that the collapse of our world had already begun. In Europe, there would still be countries that wouldn't suffer attacks: Ireland, Albania, Norway, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Switzerland. But all of those nations would be on the brink of collapse, as radiation knows no borders. Thousands of people would flee from the attacked countries to reach the borders of these nations, which would soon close their borders, unable to cope with the overwhelming number of survivors. In a scenario of mutual destruction, it is highly likely that no sovereign government would remain in Russia, the United States, or China. International aid would come from nations across the ocean, but with no functional government, little could be done in those hours. The first signs of civilizational collapse would begin to emerge. In an extremely globalized world like ours, regions thousands of kilometers away would feel the effects within the first weeks. The internet would fail in many parts of the world. Electricity would be lost in numerous regions, and oil prices would skyrocket. In reality, few places would remain stable enough for international trade. A mass migration would occur from urban areas to rural zones, with roads jammed, with people fleeing the major centers. Rebellions and prisons would arise, with clashes between state forces and uprisings. Panic would grip our streets. In such scenario, a state of emergency would be declared, and military forces would be called upon to try to manage the situation. Soon, international aid to the affected countries would cease, and non-attacked countries would focus on resolving their internal situations. First years. Let's talk about the well-known nuclear winter. This theory, proposed in the 1980s by scientists Carl Sagan and others, suggests that the numerous explosions around the world would send a significant amount of debris into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and causing temperatures to drop. However, cold is not necessarily the main problem. The biggest issue is that without sunlight, agriculture in the non-bombed countries would suffer severe damage. The already scarce food supply would become a rarity, and famine would become rampant worldwide, echoing what happened to the dinosaurs and leading humanity toward extinction. The duration of nuclear winter is uncertain. Some say it would last only a few days, while others claim it could extend for decades. We have learned much since the 1980s, and asserting that the impact of the bombs will generate a nuclear winter isn't entirely accurate. When bombs detonate, heat dissipates in place, and little actually goes into the atmosphere to block the sun. Remember the dinosaurs? The impact of the asteroid that struck Earth was comparable to billions of atomic bombs. Yes, billions with a B. Today, this theory has evolved somewhat. It is now suggested that the fires generated in the fallout would contribute to a nuclear winter, which might not be sufficient to cause such a change. But don't be too relieved. Whether a nuclear winter occurs depends on how many warheads are detonated and where they fall. Volcanoes, for instance, do have the capability to generate such atmospheric effects. If Russia and the United States, in their reckless pursuit, were to detonate their arsenals near major volcanoes like Yellowstone, the impact would be indeed similar to a nuclear winter. However, we won't explore that hypothesis in this discussion as it is not a certainty. Since the end of the Cold War, the number of these weapons has decreased, and suicidal strategies like bombarding volcanoes have been less frequently debated. It would be much more plausible for these countries to use a strategy of dropping their bombs into the ocean. This could generate tsunamis of continental proportions capable of sweeping away vast areas in one fell swoop. Various groups would try to seize the title of legitimate government of the United States, Russia, China, India, etc. It is highly likely that they would not be recognized by what remains of the world or by the majority of the population, leading to the infighting among these groups to control their regions. During this period, we would see significant similarities with the Fallout and 60 Seconds scenarios, depicting a society of people struggling to survive. Even without a nuclear winter, famine would likely occur in many parts of the world. Our trade would be paralyzed. The way our current economy operates is incompatible with a post-nuclear world, and the transition would be painfully for many people around here. The internet would become a luxury reserved for the elite and governments. A technological regression would occur, far greater than what happened during the fall of the Roman Empire. Computers, like those we have today, smartphones, and automobiles, all reliant on modern technology, will not be sustainable without Taiwan, Congo, and the Americans. Maintaining our current system would require a return to the technological state of the 1980s, which would be extremely challenging. With the major industrial powers destroyed, the remaining countries such as Brazil, Australia, South Africa, and Argentina would struggle to access technology and qualified personnel to return the world to its previous state. Without the Americans, Russians, and Chinese maintaining the balance of power, regional rivalries would likely lead to conflicts. Mexico and South Africa could survive, but with great difficulty, as their economies would be in shambles, exacerbating urban problems, and in just a few years, the borders of the world would change drastically. Oceania and South America would be the safest regions to live in this world, albeit with many difficulties. Given this instability the world would be facing, it is not impossible to say that armed forces might eventually try to seize power. After a few years, some cities that were not consumed by the bombs would begin to slowly rebuild, but the major ones would still be destroyed. With high levels of radiation, only a few brave souls scavenging through the scarce resources still left. 20 years after the apocalypse, the vast majority of the population would be living in rural areas, practically subsisting. If you walked through the cities, you would see many ruins of what was once a vibrant society. Yes, there would be still people there, but the ruins would dominate your view. The first generation born after the fallout would come of age with a completely different worldview, living a life much more akin to that of their great great grandparents than to their parents itself. The nuclear conflict would have completely changed people's perspectives. It wouldn't be absurd to say that pacifist nations like Brazil and Australia might over time become more imperialistic, using military force to secure vital resources from their neighbors. It is possible that some countries would attempt to reconstitute themselves as governments. Smaller nations in Europe and Japan might try to reunify after years of chaos, while others would find it much more difficult. The US and Russia would hardly unify ever again. Over time, the northern world would attempt to return to normalcy, but unlike the post war context, this would be entirely different. During that time, there were still many capable people to rebuild the country, whereas now, most of the population would be gone. Reconstructing Japan, England, Germany, and the United States would take decades, and it would likely take centuries to approach the level of development we have today. Today, the global population is about 8 billion. In a post-nuclear world, numbers will drop to similar levels that we've seen in early 20th century or maybe 19th. But everything I'm stating here is just speculation. There's no way to know exactly what would happen if a conflict of this magnitude occurred. What's most important here is the awareness to respect the balance that exists so that humanity never makes the mistake of engaging in such a conflict. We must admire the sheer fragility of ourselves and everything we have built throughout our history. If you've made this far in this video, please subscribe and leave a like. The channel is being rebuilt, and for this to happen as quickly as possible, I need your help. Share your suggestions for future videos in the comments. I read them all, but that's all for now. Goodbye.